Relax, it's just a joke. My cousin laughed as she smashed my phone against the wall after I refused to co-sign her loan. My mother shrugged. You can always buy another one. I stayed quiet. But the next morning, she opened her bank app and froze. I, 32M, watched the shattered glass scatter across my mother's kitchen floor, each piece catching the overhead light like tiny accusations. My cousin stood there, chest heaving, that manic grin still plastered on her face as if destroying someone's property was the punchline to a joke only she understood. My phone, the same one I'd saved for 3 months to buy, lay in pieces against the baseboard. The screen was completely spiderwebbed, the back panel cracked open, exposing the battery. My mother didn't even look up from her coffee. She waved her hand dismissively and told me I was being dramatic, that phones could be replaced, that family was forever. I should learn to take a joke. My cousin nodded along, adding that I was always so uptight, so serious about everything. Maybe if I loosened up, I wouldn't be so alone. I didn't respond. I simply bent down, collected the pieces of my phone, and walked out of that house with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The drive home was quiet. My mind kept replaying the moment, not just the destruction, but everything leading up to it. My cousin had shown up at the family dinner with paperwork tucked under her arm, and that familiar gleam in her eye that meant she wanted something. She'd cornered me in the kitchen, away from everyone else, and explained that she needed a co-signer for a business loan. Something about a boutique she wanted to open downtown. She spoke quickly, breathlessly, painting pictures of success and profitability. I'd asked her about her credit score, her business plan, her financial history. Her face had darkened immediately. She told me those were insulting questions, that family should trust family. I'd remained calm and explained that I couldn't risk my financial stability for a venture with no solid foundation. She had 2 bankruptcies in the past 5 years, 3 failed businesses, and a trail of unpaid debts that included money she'd borrowed from our grandmother before she passed. That's when her expression shifted from pleading to venomous. She called me selfish, called me a dozen other things I won't repeat. When I turned to leave the kitchen, she'd grabbed my phone from the counter where I'd set it down and hurled it against the wall with enough force that I heard the impact in my bones. I spent that evening on my laptop, phone pieces in a bag beside me. I didn't try to repair it. Instead, I began making calls using my computer, pulling up contact lists I'd backed up to the cloud. The first call was to my bank, where I'd helped my mother set up her accounts 3 years ago when she'd asked for assistance managing her finances. I was still listed as a joint account holder, something she'd wanted for emergencies. I verified the access, checked the balances, reviewed the transaction history. My mother had always been careless with money, but she'd stabilized after I'd helped her create a budget. She had about $43,000 in savings, money from the sale of my father's truck collection after he passed, plus years of careful accumulation from her pension. The second call was to my cousin's landlord. I'd met him 2 years back when I'd helped her move into her apartment. We'd struck up a conversation about property management, exchanged numbers for potential investment opportunities he'd mentioned. I asked him about her rent history. He sighed heavily and told me she was 4 months behind, that he'd been lenient because she kept promising payment was coming. He was planning to file for eviction within the week. The third call was to my aunt, my cousin's mother. I asked if she knew about her daughter's financial situation. The silence stretched long before she admitted she'd been lending money regularly, thousands over the past year, none of it repaid. She sounded exhausted, defeated. I thanked her and ended the call. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I compiled information. Credit reports I could legally access, public records of judgments and liens, bankruptcy filings that were part of the public domain. I created a detailed timeline of my cousin's financial destruction, a pattern of manipulation and failure that painted a stark picture. The next morning, I opened a new checking account at a different bank. I transferred my funds, closed my old accounts, and ensured nothing connected me to my mother's finances anymore except that one joint account, which I left untouched. Then I went to a phone store, bought a basic replacement, and activated it with a new number. Only a handful of people received the update. My boss, my 2 closest friends, my father's brother who'd always been the reasonable one in the family. I waited 3 days. 3 days of silence, of not responding to my mother's messages on social media asking why I wasn't answering my phone. 3 days of watching my cousin post photos of expensive brunches and shopping bags on her profiles, money she clearly didn't have being spent with reckless abandon. On the fourth day, I received a message from my uncle. He told me there was an emergency, that I needed to come to my mother's house immediately. I almost ignored it, but something in the wording made me reconsider. I drove over that afternoon. My mother's face was ashen when she opened the door. My cousin sat on the couch, her own expression hovering between panic and fury. My aunt paced near the window. My uncle stood in the corner, arms crossed, looking at me with something like respect. My mother's voice shook when she asked if I knew anything about her missing money. I asked her what she meant. She explained that $40,000 had been withdrawn from her savings account in a single transaction the previous morning. The bank was investigating, but the transfer had been authorized through the online portal using her login credentials. I felt every eye in the room turn to me. My cousin was the first to speak, her voice sharp and accusing. She suggested I was the only one with access, that I'd always been resentful of how close she and my mother were. My mother's face crumpled, and she asked me directly if I'd taken her money. I met her gaze steadily and told her I'd closed my access to her accounts 4 days ago, immediately after my phone was destroyed in her kitchen. I pulled up my bank statements on my new phone, showing the dates, the closure confirmations, the new account openings with completely different institutions. Everything was time-stamped, documented, provable. The room went quiet. My uncle asked who else had access to my mother's accounts. My mother stammered that no one did, that it was just supposed to be me for emergencies. I asked her if she'd ever written down her passwords, ever logged in on someone else's computer, ever let anyone watch her access her banking. Her face went pale. She looked at my cousin. My cousin's expression shifted rapidly, cycling through confusion, understanding, then desperate innocence. She insisted she'd never touch her aunt's money, that the accusation was insulting. I asked my mother if she remembered 6 months ago when her computer had crashed and she'd needed to pay some bills. My mother nodded slowly. I asked if she remembered who'd offered to let her use their laptop. My mother's eyes widened. My cousin stood up abruptly, saying this was ridiculous, that she was being railroaded. I pulled out my own laptop then, opening a folder I'd prepared. I explained that I'd done some research after the phone incident, that I'd wanted to understand exactly who I was dealing with. I displayed the credit reports, the bankruptcy filings, the eviction notices, the trail of debts. I showed the timeline of her financial collapse and the pattern of her asking family members for help that never resulted in improvement. My aunt started crying. My uncle's jaw clenched. My mother stared at the screen, her hand over her mouth. My cousin began yelling, calling me vindictive, saying I was manipulating everyone because she'd accidentally broken my phone. I corrected her calmly. It wasn't an accident. She destroyed my property deliberately after I refused to enable her pattern of financial irresponsibility. I then asked my mother if my cousin had been particularly helpful lately, particularly attentive. My mother nodded hesitantly, mentioning that she'd been coming over several times a week, helping with errands, keeping her company. I asked if she'd ever left her purse unattended, ever stepped away while logged into her banking, ever discussed her finances openly. The realization crept across my mother's face like a shadow. My cousin began backing toward the door, insisting she needed to leave, that she wasn't going to stand there and be accused without proof. My uncle moved to block her path. He told her to sit down. His voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. I continued. I explained that I'd contacted the bank's fraud department myself that morning after my uncle's message. I'd provided them with the timeline, the evidence of my account closures, the proof that I couldn't have accessed the funds. I'd also suggested they check the IP address and device used for the transfer. Banking systems tracked such things meticulously. My cousin's face drained of color. She tried to argue that lots of people could have had access, that anyone could have hacked the account. I agreed that was possible. I suggested we wait for the bank's investigation to conclude. I mentioned that if the transfer had been made from her IP address, from her device, there would be serious legal consequences. Wire fraud, elder financial abuse, theft over a certain amount carried significant prison time. My mother asked my cousin directly if she'd taken the money. My cousin's response was to burst into tears, collapsing back onto the couch, suddenly playing the victim. She insisted she'd been desperate, that she'd only meant to borrow it, that she was going to pay it back as soon as her business took off. She swore she'd never intended to hurt anyone. The room erupted. My aunt was screaming at her daughter. My mother was crying. My uncle was on the phone, presumably with the police. I stood there, calm and centered, watching the chaos unfold around me. My cousin turned to me then, her tears stopping as quickly as they'd started, her face twisting with genuine hatred. She spat that I'd orchestrated this whole thing, that I'd somehow set her up. I asked her how I could have set her up when she was the one who'd accessed the account and stolen the money. She screamed that she wouldn't have needed to if I'd just co-signed her loan, that this was all my fault for being such a selfish bastard. The admission hung in the air, damning and absolute. My uncle repeated her words into his phone. My mother stared at her niece like she was looking at a stranger. My aunt had sunk into a chair, her face buried in her hands. The police arrived 20 minutes later. My cousin tried to run, but didn't make it past the driveway. I provided my documentation, my evidence of closing my access, my timeline. The bank's fraud investigator arrived an hour later with their own findings. The transfer had indeed been made from my cousin's apartment, from her laptop, using login credentials that had been saved in her browser cache. She was arrested that evening. My mother didn't speak to me before I left. She seemed to be in shock, unable to process that her niece, the girl she'd helped raise after my uncle's divorce, had stolen from her so brazenly. Update 1. The fallout took weeks to fully materialize. My cousin was charged with multiple counts of fraud and theft. The district attorney was particularly interested in the elder abuse angle, given my mother's age and the amount stolen. My aunt hired a lawyer who tried to argue diminished capacity, financial desperation, a dozen different angles to reduce the charges. I returned to my normal life, or tried to. My new phone felt strange in my hand, a constant reminder of how quickly things could change. My mother finally called me 3 weeks after the arrest. She apologized, her voice small and broken. She admitted she should have defended me when my cousin destroyed my phone, should have seen the warning signs years ago, should have protected her own finances better. I accepted her apology but kept my distance. Trust wasn't something that snapped back into place like a rubber band. She'd chosen my cousin's narrative over basic logic, had dismissed the destruction of my property as something trivial, had enabled a pattern of behavior that had now cost her $40,000 and a relationship with her niece. The bank managed to freeze the transferred funds before my cousin could spend most of it. She'd moved the money to a new account under her name, but hadn't anticipated how quickly the investigation would move. My mother recovered $37,000 of the $40,000. The remaining $3,000 had been withdrawn in cash immediately after the transfer, likely for the expensive brunches and shopping trips I'd seen documented online. My cousin pleaded guilty to avoid trial. The prosecutor offered a deal: 5 years probation, full restitution of the $3,000 still missing, mandatory financial counseling, and a ban on accessing any family member's financial accounts or requesting loans. The alternative was a trial that could result in up to 10 years in prison. She took the deal. My mother asked me to come back as the joint account holder. I declined. I suggested she work with a financial advisor, set up better security measures, maybe take some classes on digital safety. She seemed hurt by my refusal, but didn't push. My uncle told me later that she'd finally started to understand the boundary I was drawing. My aunt stopped speaking to me entirely. She sent a message through my uncle blaming me for ruining her daughter's life, for being cruel and calculating. I didn't respond. My uncle defended me in family gatherings I didn't attend, explaining that I hadn't stolen anything, hadn't filed false charges, had simply protected myself, and helped uncover a crime that was already committed. The family fractured along predictable lines. Those who'd enabled my cousin's behavior for years sided with my aunt, creating a narrative where I was the villain who'd destroyed a desperate woman's last chance at redemption. Those who'd watched the pattern unfold with growing concern supported my actions, recognizing that accountability had been long overdue. Update 2. 6 months after the arrest, I received a letter. It was from my cousin, written from a mandatory counseling session required by her probation. She didn't apologize. Instead, she spent 3 pages explaining how I'd always been jealous of her relationship with my mother, how I'd never forgiven her for being the favorite, how I'd waited for an opportunity to destroy her. The letter was fascinating in its complete detachment from reality. She'd rewritten history entirely, painted herself as the victim of a conspiracy, Me as a mastermind who'd somehow forced her to steal money and then framed her for it. The mental gymnastics required to maintain that narrative must have been exhausting. I didn't respond. I filed the letter away with all the other documentation, a paper trail of delusion and deflection. My mother's recovery was slower than the bank's. She'd started therapy, working through decades of enabling behavior, examining why she'd always made excuses for my cousin's actions. She sent me occasional messages, updates on her progress, small attempts to rebuild what had been broken. I responded politely, but maintained my distance. The real change came when she finally acknowledged what had happened in her kitchen that day. She wrote me a long email detailing how she'd minimized the destruction of my phone, how she'd prioritized keeping peace over defending her son, how she'd been so afraid of conflict that she'd become complicit in cruelty. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply stated facts and took responsibility. That email meant more than any apology. It showed genuine understanding, real growth. I invited her to coffee the following week. We talked for 3 hours, navigating years of dysfunction and setting boundaries for future interactions. She accepted every boundary without argument, recognizing that rebuilding trust required patience and consistent action. My cousin violated her probation 8 months in. She'd opened a credit card in someone else's name, a coworker who'd made the mistake of leaving her purse in a shared office. The pattern was identical, the compulsion apparently irresistible. She went to prison for 3 years. My aunt blamed me for that too, somehow. The logic was incoherent, but grief and shame rarely followed rational paths. I heard through my uncle that she'd cut off contact with most of the family, moved to another state, started over where no one knew her daughter's history. I didn't celebrate my cousin's imprisonment. There was no satisfaction in watching someone destroy themselves so thoroughly. But I didn't mourn it either. Some people needed to face consequences before they could change, and some never changed regardless of what they faced. My mother and I rebuilt slowly. She came to my apartment for dinner once a month, respecting my space and my boundaries. She'd learned to manage her finances independently, had taken courses on digital security, had created systems to protect herself. She'd transformed her victimhood into vigilance. A year after everything imploded, I finally replaced my phone properly. I bought the model I'd originally wanted, top of the line, everything I'd saved for before. My mother offered to pay for it. I declined. She nodded, understanding that some things needed to be earned through our own effort, our own sacrifice. The phone felt solid in my hand, untainted by the memory of violence and dismissal. I set it up carefully, backing everything up, protecting it with the best case money could buy. Not because I feared someone would destroy it again, but because I'd learned the value of protecting what was mine. I never returned to those family dinners. The ones where everyone gathered and pretended dysfunction was love, where boundaries were treated as betrayals, where enablement masqueraded as support. I built a smaller circle, people who understood that kindness didn't mean tolerating harm, that loyalty didn't require self-destruction. My mother understood. She'd built her own smaller circle too, cutting away the relationships that had drained her for decades. We'd both learned the same painful lesson. Sometimes the price of peace was distance, and sometimes distance was the greatest form of self-respect. My cousin sent one final letter from prison. This one was different. No blame, no accusations, just a simple acknowledgement that she destroyed her own life and hurt people who'd tried to help her. She didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. She simply stated facts and accepted responsibility. I didn't respond to that letter either, but I kept it, not as evidence, but as proof that change was possible, even if it came too late to repair what had been broken. Some lessons could only be learned in the wreckage of our own creation. I thought about her sometimes, wondered if prison would actually transform her or just teach her better ways to hide. I hoped for the former, but suspected the latter. But ultimately, it wasn't my responsibility anymore. I'd drawn my boundaries, protected my peace, and built a life where my phone could sit safely on a counter without fear of sudden destruction. That was enough.